Using API Designer to define APIs with RAML. The API Designer is a powerful web-based IDE for writing out RAML specifications. It has a strong editor, and that editor has autocomplete features, including a shelf at the bottom that will provide you contextually with which RAML elements are available to you. On the right, it will have a preview of the API console. Think interactive documentation for your API. And on the left, a file browser where you can see your RAML file and any other supporting files or other RAML files that you're using in this RAML definition. So let's get right into our first walkthrough. Walkthrough 2.1. Use the API Designer to define an API with RAML. In this walkthrough, we're going to define resources and nested resources. We will interact with the API using the API console, define get and post methods, and specify some query parameters on this RAML spec. Let's get started. First, we need to log back into Anypoint platform if you're not already. You can go to anypoint.mulesoft.com, log in with your trial user account. And from Anypoint platform, we need to make sure that we're in the API Manager section. In the API Manager section, we'll go ahead and select our American Flights API from the previous walkthrough. And from the American Flights API dashboard here, let's define API in API Designer. Now, if you look closely inside of here, you'll notice that we have some metadata about our RAML. It's on RAML 0.8, the title is American Flights API, and the version is 1.0. Let's start by defining our first resource. Inside of here, we can define the resource flights for this API. Resources start with a / and end with a colon. Now, inside of flights, we might want to define a method, allowing us to get a full list of flights as we learned about in our REST information in the previous module. If I tab under flights and type in get, I'm able to autocomplete to get by just typing in the G and maybe GE and then hitting enter, and it will define the get method under the flights resource. Now, you can also see along the right side here where the flights resource is filling in with the corresponding method I have attached to it. As an example, let's go in and put in post now as well. Once we enter post, you can also see the tabs for both post and get being placed inside of here. So now our RAML file supports a flights resource where people can get and post things. But what if a user wants to get just a specific flight inside of here? What would that look like? Well, let's add a resource underneath flights. And let's call this resource ID with a colon. Now, obviously, ID is something that should be passed in dynamically. It should be a URI parameter, which can be passed in by the caller. So let's wrap ID in curly braces, representing that it's a value that will be passed in when somebody calls this API. Let's now go under ID and assign it its own method, telling developers that they can do a GET request against ID. So now users have the ability to call flights or call flights / an ID and get flights on both of those. Now, getting all flights might be a little bit abrasive. So what if we want to be able to filter to specific flights? Well, let's go under the get method in flights, and let's add a query parameter using our palette in the bottom. So by clicking on the query parameter from this shelf, query parameters are added in. And now we can provide a list of query parameters that are expected on the get method of flights. Let's say you want to filter by code. If we go underneath query parameters and tab in, we can define code or airline code as one of the query parameters available for the get request. And just like that, we've now successfully mocked up our first service of this API. We've got gets for getting flights filtered by codes. We've got the ability to post and create new flights. We've also got a ability to ask for a specific flight by ID. Now, as we've been building this out, our API has been building out in the right here, where we can see some of the different details about methods and resources. Let's open up the GET request for flights. Inside of GET, you'll see you have some details about the request. Not much documentation just yet, but we do have some information about the query parameters that are available. one of which is code, which is expecting a string value when it gets passed. Now, it would be real nice if we could call this endpoint and just see how it behaves. But as of right now, we can see it's disabled because of this value or key called the base URI. It's not present. Let's take a look in the next section here and see how we can set up mocking so we can make calls to this new endpoint that we've defined. Before we do, you may wish to check inside of your RAML file and make sure that it's named properly. In my case, you can see I have it named American.raml. So what you may want to do if it is saying something like API.raml is simply save the RAML in its current state, right-click on the RAML file and rename it, and then you can make sure the RAML file is named something like American.raml rather than a more generic name such as API.raml. So before we move on to talking about mocking, just make sure you've got a good name that you can easily identify, such as American.raml. Let's hit OK and jump into our next section.